Welcome to the Yankee and Canuck podcast, Best Picture Series, where we talk about all the Academy Award Best Pictures, past to present.
And I'm your host, a Yankee.
And I'm your host, a Canuck.
And today we're going to be talking about The Life of Emile Zola, released in 1937. It's the 10th movie to win Best Picture.
Also, the second biopic to win Best Picture, the first being The Great Ziegfeld, which we've covered recently. Well, this movie is definitely better, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, this is definitely an improvement.
It's also Warner Brothers production. They actually won something. MGM didn't win?
Yeah, MGM didn't win this time. Thank God. And honestly,
Can't believe it.
I can't believe it either. And honestly, it kind of shows. This film was ultimately not that bad. And this is what it's about. It's about Emile Zola, prolific French writer in the 19th century, who gets entangled in this political scandal called the Dreyfus Affair, in which a soldier called Alfred Dreyfus is falsely accused of treason by the French army.
That's right. And the movie essentially starts with his early years, Zola's, and struggling as a writer. And it doesn't go into a whole lot of detail because it jumps then to his success. He wrote a book called Nana, and it did really well. It's one of many in a series, I think 20 books total. Then later in his life, it goes into the Dreyfus Affair, which ends up being about 2/3 of the entire movie.
Yeah. So, as a matter of fact, like all the other films that are based on some sort of a source material like a book, this is based on a book too. The book is called Zola and His Time by Matthew Josephson. So it's about a 650-page book, thereabouts, and 2/3 of that book is actually dedicated to Zola, like how he got into writing, how much he struggled mostly. And then finally, he becomes a successful writer and gets involved in this political entanglement.
And we know that in real life, he was a very good human being, a good writer, good renegade, spoke truth to power, and discussed issues with the society and class and injustice. And you always need people like that to speak up and stand up.
Yeah, and that was certainly true of him later in his life. In the book that I read, though, the first, 400, 500 pages or something, you really get into detail about this guy. And really, the whole man, at least in the very beginning, he just wanted to become someone. I wanted to become someone important, a name that people will remember forever and ever. So he ended up getting into the arts very early on. So he was first a poet. That didn't work out. Then he became a playwright. That didn't work out. People hated his plays. They were booing them even before the plays would finish. And he would go home crying like, oh, no one likes me. He would write about love. He had no idea about love until later on in his life. And he decided to become a novelist. And for 10 years was writing books and was getting nowhere. No one liked his books. People were accusing him of, oh, this is obscene. His material was like obscene somehow. Because he would constantly challenge, conventional norms in society. And he would often write about people that are poor and destitute, people from the slums, and people would be like, ah, what trash. Finally, he did write a book. And in the movie, it's Nana, as you mentioned. And after years of struggling, 10 years to be precise of struggling, he finally gets a hit. And he's asked, in the movie, he asks for like an advance. Oh, can I have a mere pittance, my lord? Oh, how dare you? How dare you ask for a pittance? Here, have this check. Turns out he gets 30,000 francs, which was an obscene amount of money, because the Book of Nana was a huge hit. And in the biography that I read, I think it was more like 10,000, but similar events played out where he was just asking for an advance, and he ended up getting a really rotten deal at first. And he essentially was given a loan he had to pay back, but then he ended up getting his residuals, and he became very successful. And after that success, all of France loved him, loved his books, became very fat, drank, ended up spending most of his nights with his friends, with his wife, talking about like philosophy, science. He was big on naturalism, especially in his writings. He became a real fat cat overnight, essentially. But that's the first 2/3 of that book. In the movie, we really don't cover that much. It's, I think, a total like maybe 10 minutes of that, more or less, maybe a little more.
Yeah, that's about it. 10, 15 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. And the way the book was written, just to quickly touch on it too, is just like, it's very highfalutin. It just goes on and on how great he is, how amazing he is, oh, the struggles of him and this and that. So, well, it may be true later in life, he was very much a human rights activist and a fighter for justice and all that stuff. And most of the book, it's written as if he's just had a very high opinion of himself. He was pretty. I was getting tired of the guy. I really didn't like the guy. But I think
Mm.
after he found success, he started realizing, like, I got all this, I have all this food, I have all this wealth, but what is it? Like, what is the point? I don't see the point. And then when this political conflict comes on his lap, he's like, oh, this injustice, this is bad. We need to fight for it. We need to fight against it. There are bigger things at hand. He finds purpose in his life, in other words.
Yeah. And in the movie, it actually shows that he didn't initially want to get involved in it, but Alfred Dreyfus's wife was pleading with him to take the case um, and help out. And he was like, "No, I can't do this. Sorry. Good day to you, madam." And she's like, "Please." And he's like, "Oh, okay." Yeah.
I'll do it. Fine.
So,
Yeah, and it culminates to him writing, I think it was like a 9-page letter, or the equivalent of 9 pages, in a newspaper called J'accuse, or I don't know how to pronounce it in French. It's J'accuse. And
yes.
I read the whole thing, and essentially it's a plea to the president of France, being like, "Hey, listen, this guy Dreyfus, he's actually innocent. It's actually this other guy, and these other officers have falsely accused Dreyfus of this stuff. So it'd be cool. I would be, much obliged if you would just let my man Dreyfus go, And yeah, good job. Otherwise, Mr. President, hope to see you later." That's essentially how the letter read. But of course, after that letter was published, there was a mass upset in France. There were people that were against Zola for writing that letter. There were people that were for Zola writing that letter. The truth was all over the place. And I think the main source of controversy behind this whole thing was that the French army was held in super high esteem. If you were to criticize the army, you're criticizing your country, and you're not very patriotic if you criticize your country. So there's
Yeah.
a mass debate as to whether or not Zola was correct or not. And Zola saw himself as like a portrayer, saw himself as like the arbiter of truth and justice. And he's like, listen, I'm going to challenge all kinds of conventions. As a matter of fact, there's a scene in the movie where his publisher's like, listen, I don't think you should be publishing this stuff. You're just accusing different things left and right, and you're upsetting the establishment. You're upsetting the order, and you shouldn't do that. And Zola's like, I can write whatever the hell I want. Go away. As a matter of fact, I'm going to write this and about this Dreyfus guy, and you can't stop me.
Yeah, and they're all legitimate grievances and actual observations that he has, and put it pen to paper, and so obviously the establishment isn't happy and pleased with it, and it doesn't stop him though. I mean, perseveres and keeps writing and um, speaks truth to power, and he has that quote in the movie: "The truth marches on," and essentially that's what was happening the entire time. So
Yeah, and that's the bare essence of the rest of the film. The rest of it plays like a court drama, and I think it's a very interesting court drama.
they did a good job. Yeah, they definitely did a good job with those scenes.
Yeah, it was actually compelling. It was interesting. It is based on a true story, as much as they could portray on film, anyway. And it's just really captivating to see, like, how deep the rot is in the bureaucratic system and how hard they were willing to go to protect themselves. It wasn't enough for them to say, like, yeah, our bad. We falsely accused this guy, or we made a mistake, so we'll let him go. Their britches were apparently way too big for that. So evidently they ended up getting the real guy that was really doing the treasonous stuff, and they ended up pardoning him just to save face. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah, then there's a lot of controversial moments with the film, and then also, of course, with the actual events. And I mean, it is a biopic, and obviously important events included. I always want to know all the facts of the case situation, historical context, and but I think one of the controversies of the film is that they ignored facts like the anti-Semitism that occurred. It's obviously one of the big issues mentioned when people talk about this film, and it's a significant factor in the actual events. And while they didn't lie directly about the events in the film, they omitted or deliberately omitted key information, such as that anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, which I suppose, yeah, I mean, it could be construed as a form of lying by omission, right? So I don't know. They did a disservice, honestly, and
Yeah, and it's really curious because, like, in the book, it's very clearly stated that Zola went after this case because Dreyfus was of Jewish descent. So that was the whole reason. It was all anti-Semitism, as you mentioned. It's all like discrimination on that basis, and that's why he fought really hard, because that was like a harsh injustice in his mind. So he
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like you were saying, it is essentially what happened was the French found out, okay, someone's a traitor, someone's feeding intelligence to the enemy. It must be this Jewish soldier over here, this captain. And his handwriting looks kind of similar. And that's literally, they had some notes and they're like, it's close enough. Yes, it must be him. Send him off to Devil's Island, which is a prison colony in South America in French Guyana. And then they finally do get that evidence that he's innocent, like you mentioned. There's proof that there's someone else who's guilty. And they end up having a confession from the actual traitor. And they're like, oh, well, let's go ahead and just ignore all that. We have to save face. Can't let people know that we're corrupt pieces of you know what. So we'll just let the innocent guy stay in prison. And
Yeah, basically.
it's unbelievable.
Well, as I
It's
mentioned,
crazy.
they pardoned the actual traitor, which is insane.
Exactly.
And the guy they accused was in prison for, I think, about 5 years in really bad conditions. So his health really went on a downturn. He could have died in those conditions, honestly, had
Absolutely.
Zola not interfered and pushed
Yeah,
hard
that's what he.
for him. Yeah. So
I mean, he wrote about it. He helped expose it, and they turned around and slapped him the charge, libel charge.
yep.
So
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole thing, the spy, they were spying for Prussia, correct?
that's correct. Yeah.
And I think this was the beginning of the German Empire.
Before that, yeah,
Yeah, or the makings of it. Because the interesting thing about that, because the reason why there's an omission as to why Dreyfus was Jewish is because of the fact when this film came out, Nazi Germany was basically really becoming a thing. It was already widespread and they were already doing their stuff and whatnot. And Hollywood producers at that time, coming out of the Great Depression, it's been like a few years and they're trying to like get their bearings in order. They were making deals with Nazi Germany because they needed to screen their films there and other neighboring countries. That's how they were going to make their money. And the Nazis had a lot of leverage to say, like, okay, well, listen, we'll screen your films, but you cannot make us look bad. And also, these Jewish people, don't make mention of them in your films. And Jewish heads of these studios were like, oh, all right, fine. We have to do this because otherwise, how else are we going to make money and recover, right? It was all business, unfortunately, which is disgusting, but it is what it is, unfortunately. And Jack Warner, who is the studio head for this film, it's a Warner Brothers production, he is alleged to have omitted the word Jew from the script, even though he is of Jewish descent himself. A charge that his family later on would deny, saying like, no, 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 none of that stuff happened. But there is a historian who looked through the files and was like, yeah, he did do this. So there's a bit of back and forth, a bit of controversy behind that. But as such, when you watch the film, you had no idea whatsoever that Alfred was in fact Jewish. He's just mentioned as a soldier who's accused of treason, and that's all. But that being said, though, it doesn't really diminish the quality of the film overall. It's still about a man who's falsely accused. It's still about a writer that speaks up for him, is threatened to be imprisoned himself for libel. So he's just like, you know what? Listen, I'm putting my wealth on the line. I'm putting my reputation on the line. I'm still going to fight for this because at the end of the day, it's injustice and we cannot let this fly. Because honestly, by letting this fly, you're allowing at this point the French government to kind of do whatever they want. And that, I mean, that just erodes democracy if you allow that to happen. So it was a very important thing to fight for. And ultimately, he did prevail. It took many years, but he prevailed. And he himself had to flee France and go to England
yeah.
and hide
Went to
there.
London. Yeah,
Yeah, which really did happen. He was told, like, listen, you can rot in a prison and be a martyr, or you could just leave and you could still write and still advocate for, Alfred's cause. And he's like, all right, fine, I'll do it. And he did, and he would come back. And, and ultimately by the end of the film, he would go back and be like, this, even though this caused me great harm to my reputation, I still prevailed and I could write much about this. I have a spark. I have like this intense need to write. I have like this inspiration coming coursing through my veins. And ultimately he would die in his house through carbon monoxide poisoning because of a clogged up chimney.
allegedly.
Allegedly. Yeah, that's another controversy. It's alleged that perhaps that was an assassination. Maybe someone clogged his chimney up on purpose. We will never know. What we do know is that he just did die from carbon monoxide poisoning. He and his wife, or his mistress, actually, not his wife, his mistress, in real life. And there was a big funeral, and that's how the film ends.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I thought the going into the performances were good. Paul Muni was definitely did a great job. Um, I've seen him before in Scarface, 30s Scarface one. He played Tony
Yeah.
Calmonte.
Yeah.
Um,
In the black and white era, he was very prolific, and he was astounding in this film.
yeah, some of the other acting was fine too, but his performance was really good.
Yeah, everyone held their weight. It was
Yeah,
competently written. I think what really helped this film was the writing. It
the
was a
writing, yeah,
it was a fairly interesting concept, and it is based on a true story. But the writing helped plot it along pretty well. Like in the beginning, it was very slow. Like at first, you're just like, eh. Especially because I read the book first. I was like, okay, I get this guy's deal right away. But if I had not read the book, I'd be like, oh my god, get to the point. What's going on here?
yeah. I mean, it was a good movie. I definitely agree with you. It started out a bit slow, and I was like, oh, here we go again. Another one of these Best Picture movies.
Hmm.
It's gonna be a bore. But it did take his time initially, but it picked up and it just did a good job overall.
Yeah, so
So
I think out of the 10 pictures now that we've seen, I would put this one not at the very top. I'd put this one more above average for sure. I would say the top for me 3 or 4.
okay, there you
Yeah.
go. Yeah, it's somewhere in the middle for me. Maybe just a little bit. Top five for me so far, I would say.
Yeah, top 5
Um,
I think is more accurate to say.
yeah, and but yeah, definitely interesting, worth watching, I would say.
Yeah. Agreed. I don't know if I would recommend the book it's based on though. It's very rambly and highfalutin, and
Right.
honestly, it just paints the guy as an idiot more often than not, as opposed to a valiant hero in the film. But I digress. The film itself is worth watching. So for that, personally, I think I would give this one a 6.5 out of 10.
It's exactly what I was thinking. I'm going to rate it a 6.5 as well. Good movie. Enjoyed it. I'll add a quote from Zola. Quote, "We are like books. Most people only see our cover. The minority read only the introduction. Many people believe the critics. Few will know our content." It's a great quote.
All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in to this podcast. We're going to be watching the next one soon. It's a Frank Capra film, from what I understand, based on a play, 80-page playwright. I can't wait to read that because it's 80 pages, and I'm not going to kill myself over it.
Capra's back at it again.
Yep. So honestly, the film should be pretty good. So we'll see. But until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you and good night.